looking at notes Q-2, all transformations. So you know from working with other parent functions as well as what you've learned so far with working with sine and cosine graphs that A and D will affect your Y values as printed. So that's A and D, while B and C affect your X's opposite of logic, and that's the same as it's been with other parent functions. So a little side note here, when you're transforming your sine or cosine graph, of course, if you have that vertical translation, if you have a D value other than 0, your midline will shift with the graph. So the midline will always be Y equals D, where I need you to draw this every time if that D is not 0, and we'll definitely look at some like that. So for each of the following, find the amplitude, period, domain, range, 5 key points, and provide a graph. Just as I have before, I have already put the parent points just for sake of time saving. Okay, so on number 1, you have Y equals sine of X plus pi over 2. So you know that's a horizontal shift to the left. Remember, opposite of logic. So let's go ahead and start cranking some of these things out. So amplitude, absolute value of A, will be 1 for this graph, period. Our B value here, remember the number in front of X is still 1. So our period is still going to be 2 pi. Our domain is negative infinity, positive infinity. Our range, because the amplitude is 1, is still negative 1 to 1. So let's talk about our points. How will our points be affected? So we are going to take our x's and we are going to subtract pi over 2 because remember, opposite of logic. So in this case, we're adding pi over 2, so of course opposite, we will subtract pi over 2. Comma, because A is 1, our y values will stay the same. So let's go ahead and start getting these points. So first point, 0, 0. If I take that x value and subtract pi over 2, of course it would be negative pi over 2. My y value stays the same of 0. Here, if I take pi over 2 and subtract pi over 2, that would be 0, 1. Here, if I take pi and subtract pi over 2, that's going to be pi over 2. If you need to be writing this down, you can be, but hopefully not. Comma, keep the y value the same. Here, 3 pi over 2 subtract pi over 2 would leave me with 2 pi over 2, which would be pi. And you should notice anyway that you're increasing by pi over 2 every single time. Comma, keep that y value the same. And then 2 pi, which is really like 4 pi over 2, and subtract pi over 2, that would be 3 pi over 2, comma, 0. Okay, now in this case, you can't look at this number and compare it to the period because, of course, our starting point is not the same. So our total period should be 2 pi, and it is. It's just that we started at negative pi over 2. So this will help guide us in drawing our graph here. So I'm going to use my eraser as a straight edge. You know, gotta get creative when you don't have a whole lot of stuff with you. So I know I need to have some space back here because I start at negative pi over 2, 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2. So negative pi over 2, 0, pi over 2, pi, and then this one's a little bit bigger. See, I've made a little mistake there. And then 3 pi over 2. And then, of course, 1 and negative 1. So negative pi over 2, 0, 0, 1, pi over 2, 0, pi, negative 1, 3 pi over 2, 0. So that sine graph is still, our starting point is here on the axis. It didn't shift up or down any, so we don't need to draw our midline because our midline is still the x-axis. So that's number 1. Look at number 2. On number 2, we're dealing with cosine. We have an amplitude change here. We also have a shift. Okay, so our period, remember this B value is still 1, so our period is still 2 pi. Domain still negative infinity, positive infinity. Because we have that vertical stretch, Our amplitude change makes us have a range of -2, -2 to +2. Our points, let's talk about what will happen to our points. So for our x values, we will add pi, so x plus pi, comma, 2 times y. So let's see how much of this we can do in our head. So add pi to our first point for the x, that'd be pi. 2 times 1, which would be 2. Add pi, so remember pi is like, when we're talking over 2, 2 pi over 2. So that'd be 3 pi over 2, comma, still 0, 2 times 0, 0. Add pi, you'd get 2 pi, comma, 2 times -1 would be -2. Add pi to this, so that'd be like adding 2 pi over 2, so 5 pi over 2, comma, 0, 0 times 2y, still 0. 2 pi, add pi to my x's, so 3 pi, comma, 2, because you multiply your y's by 2. So now that'll help guide me with my graph. So on my graph, I don't start until I get to pi, and I need to make it all the way to 3 pi. So for my graph, I might have to use 2 of my erasers. Continue on. For my graph, let's put my y-axis here. I know I'll go ahead and count by pi over 2, but this is pi, so that'll be my starting point. I know I'm counting by pi over 2 because that's pi, that's 3 pi over 2. This is 4 pi over 2, which is really 2 pi. That's 5 pi over 2. This is 6 pi over 2, which is really 3 pi. And then, of course, because my amplitude is 2, I need to go up 1, 2, down 1, 2. And then my starting point is pi, comma, 2. And then 3 pi over 2, 0. And then 2 pi, comma, -2. And then 5 pi over 2, 0. And then 3 pi, comma, 2. So curve, curve, curve. All right, so that's that graph. So let's move on to number 3, last drawn example we're going to do. So first thing I noticed with number 3 is that this has got to change. Y equals, those cannot be combined because this is being multiplied here. So let's rearrange it the way we're used to seeing it, like this. Okay, so our amplitude is going to be 3 because absolute value of -3. Okay, our period, let's talk 2 pi times 1 over b. So we need to find out what b is. B is 2. So the reciprocal of 2 is 1/2. So 2 pi times 1/2 would be pi. So my period will be pi. My domain still -infinity, +infinity. My range -3 to 3. Okay. My points are going to come from, let's be careful here. So the only thing that affects my x is this. Remember that -1, there's no parentheses around this. That's a vertical change. That's a y change. So I need to multiply my x's times 1/2 times the reciprocal of b. Okay, and my y's get multiplied by -3, but then we also subtract 1, okay? So -3y minus 1. So this will be fun, won't it? So 1/2 times x, so that's still 0. Plug in 1 here, you would get -3 times 1, which is -3, minus 1, which would be -4. All right, so then next point, pi over 2 times 1/2. So if you need to write it down, do pi over 2 times 1/2. So that'd be pi over 4, comma, plug in 0 for y, -3 times 0, 0, and then -1. And the next pi times 1/2, of course, will be just pi over 2, comma, plug in -1 here. That'd make a +3 minus 1, which would be 2. Then 3 pi over 2, if you need to write it, times 1/2. would be 3 pi over 4, comma, plug in 0 here, you'd get -1. And then 2 pi times a half will just be pi, comma, plug in 1 here, -3, and then -1, which would be -4. Okay, so this will help guide us. Our lowest y value is -4. Our highest y value is 2. So, as before, we cannot take the range from just the amplitude because I have that vertical shift. So, be aware of that. When I have that vertical shift, you can't just look at the amplitude for the range. So, my lowest, least to greatest is -4. My highest is +2. So, we have to go back and change that. So now let's let that guide us when drawing our graph. So we know we need to go down to -4. We know we need to go up to +2. We also know our starting x value is 0. So I can go ahead and draw my vertical line. Then for my horizontal line, and I'll go ahead and draw a little bit further just to give us some more space. So we're counting by pi over 4, so 0, pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, which would be pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and then 4 pi over 4, which would be pi. And then remember, for our vertical, or for our horizontal line, we need to be able to go down to -4, but yet up to +2. So -1, -2, -3, -4, up to +1, +2. So then let's start drawing our points and then we can draw our midline. So 0, -4, pi over 4, -1, pi over 2, 2, 3 pi over 4, -1, and then pi -4. So of course this helps us see that our midline, this kind of went too far there, didn't it? I think that space was too long here. That helps us see, sorry, it's going to bother me if I don't correct it. That helps us see here that our midline is here at -1. So we're going to draw a dashed line at -1 and we will label it midline. That's our midline here at y equals -1. Okay, and we've graphed all our points. We're good to go. So now let's just look at some equations and think about what the point transformations would be. So on number 4, 4 minus cosine of pi x over 5. So again, on this one, you would want to change it to y equals negative cosine of pi x over 5, or you can even say pi over 5 times x, and then plus 4. So what would we do to our points? We would take the reciprocal of pi over 5, so 5 over pi times x, comma, negative y plus 4. Okay, remember x is here, y is here, and here. Similar here, you would change this to y equals 3 sine of 3 pi x over 2 minus 1. That's supposed to be an arrow and it really doesn't look like it. Okay, so then on this, your point transformations would be reciprocal of 3 pi over 2, so 2 over 3 pi times x, comma, 3y minus 1. All right, and last but not least here, you would also want to change this to y equals sine of x minus pi over 4, and then plus 7. So what would the point transformations be for this? it would be x plus pi over 4, right, comma, y